Let's turn to the liturgy. We looked at these two passages over the last few weeks. Today we're going to read these verses in their entirety. We read the English 3 weeks ago. We read the Hebrew and Greek as they're normally found in your Bibles 2 weeks ago. We read the Greek and the Hebrew as you might find them in specialized Bibles last week. And then this week we're going to read all of them together. So get strapped in and stay in your seat until the ride comes to a complete stop, because we're going to read through a lot tonight. We're going to read Genesis 1 through 5 in the English. Then I'm going to read it in the Hebrew. Then I'm going to read it in the Greek. And then I'm going to turn to John 1 through 5 and read it in the English. And then I'm going to read it in the original Greek. And then I'm going to read it in the supplied Hebrew. Understanding that the Greek of Genesis is an added translation from 2,000 years ago. And the Hebrew of the New Testament is an added translation supplied from probably maybe 100 or 200 years ago or something like that. Okay? You guys ready? Here we go. Looking at my page here, let's start on the left side of the page and just read through all of the English of Genesis 1:1 for us. Let's see. Do I want to blow that up? Let me take a look. Yeah, I think I'll make that. How big do I want that? That's too big. Let's go with that. I think we'll try that. All right, Genesis 1:1, English Standard Version reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Verse 2, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." Verse 3, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." Verse 4, "And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness." Verse 5, "And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day." Let's go back up and read the Hebrew. Over on the right side of the page, starting right there. The Hebrew says, "Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz." Verse 2, "V'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu, v'choshek al panei tahom, v'ruach Elohim merchefet al panei hamayim." Notice in the Hebrew, we have this word ruach, which is, as we talked about earlier, is the Hebrew word for spirit, but it's also the same Hebrew word for breath or wind. The wind of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The breath of God hovered over the surface of the waters. One of these days we'll do a little bit more digging into the Hebrew, and I'll show you some clever nuggets there. Verse 3 says in the Hebrew, "Vayomer Elohim yahi or vayahi or." Verse 4, "Vayara Elohim et haor kitov, vayavdel Elohim ben haor uven hachoshek." And if you listen to the Hebrew, or and choshek, or is light and choshek is darkness. You're going to hear that when you listen to John's rendering, where John talks about light and darkness in John 1:1 in the first few verses. You're going to hear those same Hebrew terms, or for light and choshek for darkness. So listen up for them when I get to that part of my liturgy. Verse 5 in the Hebrew says, "Vayikra Elohim lo or yom v'lachoshek kara lailak." Again, we have order and choshek, light and darkness. And then the final clause says, "Vayihi erev vayihi voker yom echad." The evening and the morning were day one, literally. It says first day in your translation over there in the English, but I disagree with that translation. It really should say day one, not first day. All right, let's turn now to a reading of the Greek of Genesis 1:1, and this is from my tool found at greekdoc.com, which you can find online, and I highly recommend that you turn to this version so you can look at the Septuagint Greek. We've got English and Hebrew up there, which I'm not going to read because I already read it. Let's just turn to the Greek. The Greek, English, the Greek right there of Genesis 1:1 says, "In arake apoias in hatheos tan uran ketain gain." Verse 2, right there, says, "He de gein aerotas kai akatas skuastas kai skatas epano tes abusu kai pneuma theu epiferoto epano tu hudatas." Verse 3 says, "Kai apen ha theos genetheto phos kai egeneto phos. The word for light in the Greek is phos. That's where we get our English word, I believe, phosphorus or phosphorescent or something like that. The Greek word phos is related to that same English word, phosphorus or phosphorescent, I believe. Look it up for me and tell me what you think in your comments. Verse 4 in the Greek of Genesis 1, verse 4 says, Kai Eden hotheos to phos hati kalon, Kai diakorasin hotheos ana meson to photos, Kai ana meson to skatus. And then verse 5 says, Kai ekalasin hotheos to phos hemeron kai ta skatos, ekalasin nukta, kai egeneto espera, kai egeneto proi, hemera mia. And that'll do it for the reading from Genesis, both in the English, the original Hebrew, and the Greek Septuagint. Let's turn now to John 1 through 5. Read the English, the original Greek, and then the Hebrew translation as part of our liturgy tonight. English Standard Version, left side of the page right there, reads, verse 1, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Verse 2, He was in the beginning with God, speaking of this eternal Word. Verse 3, All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. Of course, we know from this verse that John is linking the creatorship of God in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created, with Jesus, the eternal Word, being the creator. All things were made through Him. Jesus, the eternal Word, is the agency of creation. And we're going to see from the from the Greek rendering that we read here in a second, that the Greek of John 1:1 closely matches the Septuagint Greek of Genesis 1:1. I'll point that out for you this time. John 1:4 in English, In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And then in verse 5, when we get to the Greek, notice those Hebrew words that we're going to look at in a moment. Phos, rendered light, and Or and Hoshek out of the Hebrew that we're going to see here when we read the Hebrew of John 1:5. The light shines in the darkness, he says in English, and the darkness has not overcome it. So we're going to see those words, light and darkness, show up again. Let me jump back up and read the Greek for you of this same passage on the right side of the page right there. This is the normal rendering, the authoritative Greek that we're used to. This isn't the translation Johnny come lately that came around 100 or so years ago. This is the authoritative Greek that we use from our Bibles. The Greek says, In arche ein halagos, kai halagos, ein pros ton theon, kai theos ein halagos. And in the Greek, en arche, right, en arche, in the beginning, closely resembles, if I go back up to the Septuagint rendering from the Hebrew that we looked at earlier of verse 1, notice the very first two words from the Septuagint are en arche, in the beginning, en arche. That's rooted in the same wording that John used, en arche. So John, who was writing likely in Greek, because that's what we have preserved for us, was likely familiar with the Septuagint Greek that we just read earlier. Isn't that really fascinating? All right, let's keep reading. John 1:2 in the Greek says, Hutas ein in arche pros ton theon. Verse 3, Panta di autou egeneto kai koros autou egeneto ude hein ha gegonin. Verse 4, in autou zoe ein kai he zoe ein ta phos ton anthropon. Again, that word for light is phos, like we looked at, like is related to our English word, I believe, phosphorus or phosphorescent or something like that, something that relates to light. And then verse 5 says in the Greek, kai ta phos, right, the light, en te skatia phane, kai he skatia auta u katelabin. And that'll do it for the rendering from the Greek. Let's turn now to the Hebrew rendering of John 1:1. And remember, when we get to verse 5, listen for the words or, which is light, and choshek, which is darkness, which were found in the Hebrew of Genesis 1, when God talks about creating light and darkness. And we're going to hear John use those same Hebrew words from this particular translation into Hebrew. John 1:1 in the Hebrew, starting on the left side of the page right there. The Hebrew says, Bereshit haya hadavar, v'hadavar haya et Elohim, v'hu hadavar haya Elohim. Verse 2, Hu haya merosh et ha-Elohim. Verse 3, Kol hama'asim nihu al yado, ve'ein davar asher na'asa mibal adaiv. Verse 4, in him was life, bo nimza chayim. The word for life is chayim, this word right there. You've probably heard l'chaim, to life, right? This is the Hebrew word for life. In Yeshua, in this word, the eternal word, in this word was life, bo nimza chayim, and life, v'chaim, and the life was the light of men. Haim or ha'adam. The word for light is or, just like we saw in the Hebrew rendering of Genesis 1:1 when God created light and darkness. And now in verse 5, as rendered in Hebrew, we see these same Hebrew words. The English says, light shines in the darkness. The Hebrew says, v'ha'or zoreach ba-choshek. So we have or and choshek, same Hebrew words that were used over in Genesis. V'ha'or zoreach ba-choshek. And the darkness, v'chachoshek lo yechilenu. It did not apprehend this darkness. It didn't even comprehend it or apprehend it or something like that. And that'll do it for our liturgy tonight, which encompassed the English, the original Hebrew, the original Greek, and the translations of the Greek and the translation of the Hebrew. That'll do it for our liturgy.